Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group. Welcome to this recording of our May 21, 2021 presentation. Our subject for this presentation was Zouave units in the Civil War, with a focus on the 146th New York Zouaves. Our speaker was Patrick Schroeder, National Park Service Chief Historian at Appomattox National Historic Site in Virginia, who for decades has been a reenactor, a Zouave reenactor. And our very own board member Bob Johnson helped him get ready.
Usually when I do that, the first thing he does is that singing shots right at my head.
Oh, that's
All right.
great.
All right, well, thank you, sir. Okay, appreciate it. You'll make a good Zouave.
A big hand for Bob. Our speakers put a lot of effort into the work they share with us, and many prefer to present in person. That's the case today, as our speaker in person is able to show us some of the Zouave uniforms. And I thought that was him for a second. and I'm sure he will.
He lost his head.
That's right. I'm sure he will correct me in the pronunciation of Zouave. But in any event, our speaker today is Patrick Schroeder. He's the National Park Service Chief Historian at the Appomattox Courthouse National Historic Site, where he has served since 2002. Patrick was born at Fort Belvoir, Virginia in 1968. I guess an Army brat. Excellent.
For a short time.
I was as well. He has a bachelor's degree in historical park administration from Shepherd College, now university, in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, which of course is just down the street from Harper's Ferry, and an MA in Civil War history from Virginia Tech. From the age of 18 on, Patrick has been working with the National Park Service, first as a seasonal interpreter, then eventually as a ranger. He is a reenactor, witness, and an author, having written 30 myths about Lee's surrender in 1993, which is currently in its 12th printing. There are some copies over there in case you would like to read that. You have to buy it first, I think. But anyway, further, he founded the Appomattox Fund in concert with the Civil War Trust to save land important to the climactic events of April 1865. So thank you, Patrick, for sharing your valuable time with us today.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's an honor and privilege, and I'm glad to see you were willing to venture out today to hear my program. It's kind of a combination of two programs. I do a program called Zouaves, America's Forgotten Soldiers, and this one's going to delve into specifically the 146th New York and their role at the Battle of the Wilderness. So many times people see these uniforms and they say, well, that's not American. And most people today don't know what a Zouave is, but at the time of the Civil War, everyone knew what a Zouave was. Not only did they know what a Zouave was, they wanted to be one if they could. And one of the top questions that people are going to say, especially when we're out doing living history programs and stuff, is, boy, you made great targets. But that's looking at it from today, back to the 1860s. But in the 1860s, the idea wasn't camouflage, it wasn't hiding, it was fighting in lines of battle in two ranks. So it didn't really matter what you wore. It was, you could be invisible. You stood just as much chance of getting shot as if you were wearing a Zouave uniform. But the thing is, just like the British wearing red coats, you wanted your enemy to know what they were fighting. And the Zouaves had such a reputation. The reputation of the Zouaves, could assist them in battle. In fact, the 5th New York at the Battle of Hanover Courthouse in 1862, there's a Confederate account that says, we saw the red trousers come onto the field and we knew it was time to leave. So that is what the uniform is doing for you, because it had such a reputation, especially building up with the French Zouaves in the Crimea War. So the uniform doesn't originate originate here in North America. It is in North Africa. In the 1830s, the French were colonizing Algeria and Morocco. There was a tribe there called the Zouaves. And the Zouaves wore their native North African dress, but they eventually volunteered to assist the French army in peacekeeping in the area. Well, the French came to greatly admire the Zouaves, and eventually some of the Frenchmen were mustering out and joining the North Africans. So they decided, instead of having men leave and join the North Africans, they would form their own Zouave regiments, outfit them in the North African dress, but they'd be, the ranks would be filled by Frenchmen. So they started 3 regiments of French Zouaves. And the native North Africans, they were put in a separate unit called the Tirailleurs Algériens, and that was the uniform of the Tirailleurs Algériens. The man on the left, they nicknamed them Turcos, and that is the style of uniform that the 146th New York adopted, and they're the only unit, north or south, in the Civil War that wore this color Zouave uniform with the sky blue and yellow trim.
Is that a skirt?
No, there are 2 separate legs. Oh, there. Well, see, that's one of the things, the uniqueness of the Zouave uniform is that the true Zouave uniforms had no separate legs. They were just a bag with 2 holes in the bottom of it where their feet came out. Now, the 5th New York, which I'll show you some photos of shortly, had true Zouave uniforms where the legs just came out of a bag. But a lot of Americans Americanized the Zouave uniform so it wasn't as baggy in the trousers. All right, so the Zouaves in North Africa built up a reputation. They had some idiosyncrasies. They wore a lot of gear, and they also were known for having mascots, parrots and monkeys and so forth. They were the only French soldiers allowed to wear a beard at the time. The Zouaves also had women that went with them. So ladies, we're being all inclusive here. They were called vivandières or cantinières. You can see the canteen right there. And these are women that actually traveled with the regiment. They weren't laundresses, they weren't women that sewed, they weren't women of the night. They were actually attached to the Zouave regiment. Next slide. You saw a drummer there on the left. This is Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III. He loves Zouave, so he eventually forms his own Zouave regiment called the Imperial Guard Zouaves. So the Zouaves make a name for themselves in the Crimea War. Now, a lot of Americans don't know anything about the Crimea War. I'm sure you folks do know probably all about the Crimea War. 1854, 1855, the French and the British are going to go support the Turks against the Russians in Crimea. And they send some of the French Zouaves to fight over there, and they do very well. They receive praise from British generals and French generals as well as being the finest soldiers in the world. We have an observer over there. At the time, was a captain in the U.S. Army. His name is George B. McClellan. And McClellan says, the Zouave is a beau idea of a soldier and the finest light infantry the world can produce. And these are messages and reports are coming back to the United States about the engagements of the Zouaves in the Crimea. In fact, at the Battle of Balaclava, where the charge of the Light Brigade was made, Zouaves were on the right flank trying to save the Light Brigade as they were getting pulled back. But the real fame comes at the siege of Sebastopol, where in September of 55, they actually take the Molotov, which causes Sebastopol to capitulate. And here they are overrunning the position at the Molotov. And out of the 600 Zouaves that made the assault, 311 were killed or wounded. It was such an exploit that I like this with reenactors today, they reenacted their own scene of taking the Molotov for a photographer, right? How about that? Is that a dramatic photograph? Or what? You even got our cannonball right there in front of that guy laying on the earthworks. Another thing that happens in the Crimea is that the cigarette is born. So if you like cigarettes, you can thank the Zouave. If you don't like cigarettes, you can curse the Zouave. Because this Zouave had lost his pipe and had no cigars, so he took out a cartridge, emptied out the bullet and paper, put his tobacco in there, and rolled the first cigarette. So if you're in a store and you see rolling papers and you see a Zouave on one of the papers called Zigzag, that is commemorating the birth of the cigarette in the Crimea. All right, next one. So the French Zouaves go on. They fight in Italy in the Austro-Sardinian War. Again, reports are coming back to the United States of the exploits of these Zouaves. And there's a young man who's originally from Mechanicsville, New York. You want to go to the next slide? Named Elmer Ellsworth. Dashing young man. Ends up going out west to Chicago. He works for somebody that you might have heard of in a law office called, named Abraham Lincoln. He is trying to get a position in the Illinois militia with one of the companies out there, and he has to go out to Rockford and organize them to show what he can do before they'll accept him into the Chicago Society. And he meets a French surgeon named Charles de Villiers. And de Villiers had served with the Zouaves in North Africa. And he tells Ellsworth details of the uniforms and the maneuvers, because Zouaves were expert skirmishers and with the use of the bayonet. And Ellsworth grabs a hold of it. And next slide. And he takes his, he is now given command of the Chicago Cadets, and he takes this company and transforms them into the Chicago Zouave Cadets. Now he modifies the Zouave uniform. It's not quite as baggy, but he also puts a lot of buttons up and down on their jackets. Now he's not content with just outfitting these fellas in fancy uniforms. He's going to train them to be the best soldiers in the country. And in 1859, there is a drill competition, not far from where the company is based in Chicago, and militia companies from all over the country come out, and drill competition at the time is equivalent to modern day sporting events. Baseball games, football games, hockey games, thousands of people, and this went on all throughout the country. They come out to the village green or the drilling area for the town, and the militia companies would compete against each other. Everybody would cheer for whoever they thought was best. So they had a national competition. And at this national competition, there's a flag given to the national champions. So, next one. So he drills his men to perfection. He even comes up with a maneuver called rally by fours, which is eventually incorporated into the U.S. Army tactics. Go ahead. This is an illustration of them. So what happens is they win that national drill competition. 20,000 people are on hand to witness it. And they're celebrated as the national champions. In 1860, they go on a national tour to show their drilling prowess and kind of show off and put a challenge out there to see if anybody could defeat them. And this is an illustration of them made in Utica, New York, which after I was born at Fort Belvoir, my dad got out of the Army and moved back to my mom's hometown of Utica, and that's what leads to my connection to the 146 New York, which came from Utica and Ida County. So this is them drilling there in 1860. You know what happens when they leave Utica? The militia companies say, hey, I don't want to wear these old colonial style uniforms anymore, because some of them still looked like out of the Revolutionary War. I want to dress like this. So there's several Zouave companies that spring up out of Utica, where basically the militia companies change their uniforms for the Zouave uniform, because two things has happened. One is they're putting on the reputation of being the toughest soldiers in the world, which were the French Zouaves, and they're emulating the National Drill Team Champion company. All right, next one. I love this photograph. I couldn't decide what to cut out of the program, but here they are drilling at a park in New York City. And here's Elmer Ellsworth. Ladies, the women and girls would swoon over Ellsworth. He was kind of, I don't know who the Hollywood icon for a man is these days, but I used to say Leonardo DiCaprio. He was the Leonardo DiCaprio of the Civil War. But so many people wanted to see them that they would even get up in the trees to get a bird's eye view of what's going on. So they tour over 26 cities, mainly in the Northeast and Midwest. They do get as far south as Baltimore. But everywhere they go, they spread this Zouave uniform. And another favorite photo of mine is this one here. You have Ellsworth's Zouave cadets in different positions of the manual. But my favorite thing that's going on here is look at that guy. See that guy there? He's looking at that guy. And why is he looking at him like that? Next slide. He don't want to wear this gray uniform of the militia anymore. He wants to wear a uniform like the Chicago Zouave cadets. All right, next slide. So here's Elmer Ellsworth, dapper looking, 23 years old at this time. There's the national championship flag. Quite a celebrity. Anywhere he went, people wanted to, they would sell carton of visites of him and get photographs taken with him. So he goes back to Chicago. He's working for Abraham Lincoln. He's actually kind of like a PR guy for Abraham Lincoln. Goes to Washington as one of Lincoln's secretaries. When the shots are fired on Fort Sumter, he declares he's leaving Lincoln's staff and he's going to go to New York City and raise a regiment of what he would call fire Zouaves. Why are they called fire Zouaves? I never understood this as a kid. Firemen, right? He's going to raise them from the New York City Fire Department because he thinks those are the toughest men in the country. Used to battling fires. So he goes to New York and raises a regiment of fire Zouaves. And the Zouave uniform really isn't all that much to look at for the 11th New York. They call themselves Zouaves, kind of based on the Chicago cadets, but you know, I don't know if we call it a really true Zouave uniform. The uniform is made out of gray wool that is known as shoddy. It falls apart fairly quickly, and they have to get new uniforms, which are more true to the Zouave attire. So here he is leading them out of New York. There's Elmer right there. Marching down Broadway to go and save Washington. Next slide. So they're outside of Washington. And when Virginia secedes, they're going to send troops into Virginia, and Ellsworth takes 11th New York and goes into Alexandria during the night, and he sees a flag flying over, a secessionist flag flying over the Marshall House Hotel. Lincoln can see this from the White House. And Lincoln has a small entourage with him. They're going to the telegraph office to secure that. And he goes by and then stops and says, that flag must come down. And it's in the early hours of the morning, he goes up, takes the flag down. The proprietor, James Jackson, vowed to defend that flag with his life. He meets Ellsworth as he's coming down the stairs, fires a barrel of his shotgun into his chest, killing him instantly. Then Frank Brownell, go back one if you would. Frank Brownell engages Jackson and Brownell fire at the same time. Brownell had fallen down the stairs, so he was getting up. And Jackson unloaded the other shotgun blast at him, and it's not shot. It's not BB's type shotgun. It's a slug. The slug goes into the door frame behind Brownell. Brownell hits Jackson at the bridge of the nose and left eye, killing him instantly. So that gives you your martyrs north and south. Jackson and Ellsworth. Ellsworth, go ahead. There's where the shotgun bullet went into his chest. The Daughters of the American Revolution, who acquired the uniform, did all they could to get the blood stains out of the jacket. That's why it looks so clean. So, next one. Frank Brownell was promoted to lieutenant for being in the regular army for being Ellsworth's avenger, and he got the Medal of Honor and became quite a celebrity himself. So, in the Civil War, well, you remember in the Texas War of Independence, it was Remember the Alamo, right? In the Spanish-American War, it's Remember the Maine. In World War II, it's Remember Pearl Harbor. But in the Civil War, the cry in the north was, remember Ellsworth, father of Zouaves. Next one. And his unit goes on to fight at the Battle of First Manassas, Bull Run, and this is an encounter with Jeb Stuart's cavalry, who hits 2 companies. If you're into Bull Run, Manassas, one of the misconceptions is they didn't charge the whole regiment of fire Zouaves, they just charged 2 companies on the right flank. But there they are. Now they have fezzes, they're wearing a red fireman shirt, they got semi-baggy dark blue trousers, so they're looking more as traditional Zouaves. But there's what's going on, it's called the Zouave craze. Many units that are enlisting, north and south, you can outfit yourself however you see fit. So some of them opt to go with the Zouave uniform and put on that reputation. And they were written about in song and story, and you can find a Zouave just about anywhere, right? Next one. It didn't just stick to soldiers, it went to children and civilians, especially ladies started wearing these short-cut jackets. So the Zouave influence was spreading throughout society. Next one. Zouaves weren't just in the north. There were more Zouave units in the north, and they lasted longer in the north. They lasted throughout the war. But there were Zouave units in the south who did kind of peter out because they couldn't get the uniforms issued to them as the war went on. But this is the Charleston Zouave Cadets, Weeks Louisiana Tigers, which is probably the most famous southern one. Next. And Copen's Louisiana Zouave Battalion. So they do look very true to the French Zouaves. Next one. And the Copen's Louisiana Zouave Battalion, there they even have a Bébandière, and there's her canteen, and she's giving a drink here to this drummer. And there were some Bébandières in some of the northern Zouave regiments as well. The most famous being the 114th Pennsylvania. I may have taken out her image because I've reduced the length of this program. Mary Teppy with the 114th Pennsylvania, that at the Battle of Fredericksburg actually goes into battle with the regiment and takes a bullet in the ankle. So the Zouave uniforms varied by unit. Some were in the tradition of the French Zouaves, others became Americanized. This is a 12th Indiana Zouave jacket. Next one. Here is the 72nd Pennsylvania Zouave, Fire Zouaves. Now, if you've been to Gettysburg, where Pickett's charge was made, and at the angle, there's a soldier with his rifle up over his head, ready to club the Confederates as they come forward. That's the monument of these fellas, 72nd Pennsylvania Fire Zouaves. And they went with the more of the Chicago Zouave cadet style with all the buttons on the jacket. One of the more famous Zouave units is Colonel Rush Hawkins' 9th New York Zouaves. Next one. This is the 10th New York National Zouave uniform. This is James Taylor, who became a sketch artist in the Shenandoah Valley. Next one. This is the 53rd New York, the Mule Zouaves. And Zouave regiments, unlike the French, or even the 5th New York, who they were recognized for the discipline. Not all Zouave regiments were great units. The 53rd New York was particularly bad, and they had to disband it. But they didn't have great looking uniforms. Because putting on a Zouave uniform in the American Army didn't give you special training or anything like that. You weren't elite troops unless your commanders made you that way. Next one. This is 55th New York, the Lafayette Guard, who was organized by Regis de Trobriand, and each company wore a different French-style uniform, and so he did have a company of French, of Zouaves, and look at that, see, ma'am, you were, one of the ladies was asking, this is just a bag with your legs coming out. 164th New York, the Corcoran Zouaves, like this, this fellow's over here playing with some puppies. These kids are, I hope the mother didn't find out, they're playing cards there. But this regiment actually reached the Confederate works at the Battle of Cold Harbor, next slide, where Colonel McMahon is killed getting atop of the Confederate fortifications. So again, I show this one primarily because Zouave uniforms did not disappear as I used to recruit captain as a kid, and he was one that would say Zouave uniforms disappeared because they were impractical. But that's not true. Next one. 165th New York, 2nd Battalion of York Zouaves. Here they are in the winter of 1864-1865, still wearing their Zouave attire when they were posted in Winchester, Virginia. 76th Pennsylvania, Keystone Zouaves. This regiment, have you seen the movie Glory? Y'all know about the 54th Massachusetts attacking Fort Wagner? Well, 2 weeks before they did that, this regiment, the Keystone Zouaves, tried to take the fort all by themselves and didn't do so well. But you don't ever hear about that part of the story. Next one. One of the most famous Zouave units that you see, because they were photographed so much, was at 114th Pennsylvania that Mary Tepley served with. And they were photographed so much because after the Battle of Gettysburg, they became headquarters guard for the Army of the Potomac for General Meade. So they were always around headquarters, and it was a great photo opportunity. So you see a lot of photos of the 114th Pennsylvania. Somebody had started to colorize this, which is pretty neat when you see a black and white photo come to life. There's a fully tinted College Zouaves who had a unique, you can always tell if they're a College Zouave, they're the only unit that had light blue cuffs, so they show up white on black and white photographs. So if you find a photo of a Zouave and you don't know what regiment he served with, and they have those light blue cuffs, 114th Pennsylvania. Go ahead. And here they are making their charge across the slaughter pen at the Battle of Fredericksburg. There's Colonel Collis carrying the flag and the regiment engaged there. And that's where Mary Tepley. Zouaves uniforms, like I said, not only didn't disappear, in some cases there were more of them as the war went on, because General Warren and, I'll save this one. This is 155th Pennsylvania Zouaves, but they don't receive their Zouave uniform. They're from Pittsburgh. They don't receive their Zouave uniform until the winter of 1863-64. And they're wearing this at the Battle of Wilderness, so, and they are brigaded with 146th New York as well. In fact, the last casualty, the last fatality of the Union Army in the war was a Zouave. William Williams, killed at the Battle of Palmetto Ranch in Texas in May of 1865. So, first Union casualty, Ellsworth, the Zouave, and William Williams, the last one, the Zouave. Next image. All right, so we're going to start to get us into the 146th New York, but first of all, you have to understand about the 5th New York. The 5th New York was raised by Abram Duryea in New York City, and he outfitted them after the 2nd Regiment of French Zouaves, traditional French-style uniform. They became a favorite subject of the artist Winslow Homer. This one is called the Briarwood Pipe, and he's whittling on the pipe, and here's another man with the pipe. Go ahead. And this one is pitching quoits, playing horseshoes. So there's Abram Duryea there and his officers, and he is a former commander in the 7th New York Militia, so that was your most famous militia group in New York City. But he has a lot of pull and influence, so he pulls in some pretty good officers for his regiment. Next slide. Which includes later General, he's Lieutenant Colonel, second in command to Duryea, Gouverneur Kemble Warren. Go ahead. There's actually 8 generals. As far as I know, that's the most generals to come out of one specific unit. So from the 5th New York, you have Warren, Duryea's a general. There's another Duryea, Hiram Duryea, he becomes a general. Judson Kilpatrick, Henry Davies in the Appomattox, some of his troops were involved in last fighting in the Appomattox, and Joseph Hamlin that becomes a general in the 6th Army Corps. So the 5th New York gets sent down onto the Virginia Peninsula to Fort Monroe, and they fight in the first battle at a place called Big Bethel, June 10th, 1861. Here they are charging the Confederate fortifications, and in doing so, in this first engagement, more than a month before the Battle of Bull Run, they suffer over 30 casualties. So they are in the first fighting of the war. Next. After that, they get sent up to Baltimore, where Governor Kemble Warren now takes command of the regiment and drills them to perfection. They are experts in the Zouave, the bayonet drill, just like the French Zouaves. So this is where the regiment really comes together in Baltimore. I just left this photo in there because I thought you'd like to see him. How about that haircut? Like to keep the hair short, right? So to keep the bugs and critters out of it when they go on campaign. But tough-looking young soldier of the 5th New York. Go ahead. They get sent down to the peninsula, and their big battle on the peninsula is at the Battle of Gaines' Mill, where they are on the field all day, repulse a number of Confederate advances, suffer 162 casualties themselves, but just on one regiment alone, the 1st South Carolina Rifles, they inflicted over 300 casualties. So they did very well at the Battle of Gaines' Mill, despite the Confederates breaking through on the center, and left of the line, the 5th New York was holding the right with the U.S. regulars. But their day of reckoning would come not long after that at the Battle of Second Manassas, where they are left out on the left flank while General Pope makes assaults against a railroad cut. They're supporting a battery, and little does Pope realize, or won't listen, Longstreet has come up on the left flank, and there's only 2 regiments, the 5th New York Zouaves and the 10th New York Zouaves, and they get overrun and lose almost 300 men in about 10 minutes. But they do receive new recruits, and the regiment continues on until it is released from service during the Battle of Chancellorsville. They have a new regiment that has come into the brigade, 146th New York, from Oneida County, and they just wear these regular old Federal blue uniforms. But they've been specifically sent to the brigade with the 5th New York because General McClellan and General Warren had been conspiring that they were going to form a Zouave brigade, and it would be commanded by Warren. So what they're doing is they're looking for the best commanders to bring these regiments into the brigade. They picked 146th New York. Why? Because it's commanded by Kenner Garrard. He has been the superintendent at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. So they get the 146th New York, and they get the 140th New York from Rochester. Why? Because Patrick O'Rourke is their colonel, and he has finished first in his class at West Point. So those 2 regiments come into the brigade. They're wearing uniforms like this, but they're slated to get Zouave uniforms. So it's going to take a little while for that to happen. They fight at the Battle of Fredericksburg, not very heavily engaged, and they are engaged, several companies are engaged at the Battle of Chancellorsville. On June 3rd, 1863, they received their Zouave uniforms, which is patterned after the Turcos in North Africa. The men are very pleased. I'm going to get on the computer to go to my outline because what you're going to get from here on out is a new program altogether. Anybody have any questions before we get into the 146th New York?
Is that building where Ellsworth got killed still there right now?
It is. It used to be a Holiday Inn, and I'm not sure what it is now, but the building is still there.
And you can see the stairs and everything where you...
I've never been inside. There's a plaque on the outside, but I've never been inside. I don't know how much it retains of its original features. A lot of soldiers would go in there and chip out pieces of wood from the staircase as souvenirs. So I've seen those on auction sites over the years. Yes, ma'am?
Did there find to be a disadvantage to the baggy pants and fighting?
I'm sorry, one more time?
Was there a disadvantage to the outfit for combat purposes?
No. In fact, Zouave uniform was based on freedom of movement. So the men liked it better than the federal issue uniform. And what we're going to see here is not only does the 146th get their Zouave uniform in 1863, but the 140th New York, 155th Pennsylvania get their Zouave uniforms in 1864. But the government takes over the issuing of uniforms in 1864, and they put a caveat on it, is that if you are wearing a Zouave uniform, the government will continue to provide your regiment with Zouave uniforms. But if you're not wearing a Zouave uniform, you can't request a Zouave uniform, because the biggest thing with Zouave uniforms, as far as the government is concerned, price. It takes a whole lot more work to produce a uniform like this over the standard federal issue uniform. All right, so the 146 New York, it's this uniform. They are very pleased with it. They said it was their own distinguished uniform, unique, and the only pattern of this style Zouave uniform in the Army. And so there, I'm just going through some images of what it looked like on the men. Neither one of these soldiers are identified, but it gives you a good idea of what it looked like. Next one. This fella here on the left, Albert Ross, is interesting because apparently they didn't have enough parts of the Zouave, the new uniform for the 146. He was a transfer. So 325 men from the 5th New York had signed up for 3 years service instead of 2 years service. So they send the 2-year men home, and they send the 3-year men to the 146. And they ain't real happy. First of all, they thought they'd been duped because they were told they could go home with the regiment. And second of all, the 146 at the time is wearing a plain old blue uniform, not a Zouave uniform, but less than a month later they get, go back into it. They get the Zouave uniform, but we've got to speculate, really, it's kind of interesting. He has on has 146 New York trousers, but he has on a 5th New York jacket, Albert Ross. Now, I don't know who this fella is, but he does have on a 146 New York uniform, but he has a sash from the old 5th New York, because the 5th New York had this triangle in the sash, where the 146 New York didn't. So we know he was originally in the 5th New York and then goes into the 146. My favorite thing about this is check out that cigar he's chomping on there. So the 146 New York, now outfitted in their Zouave uniform, is on the Gettysburg campaign, and they fight on Little Round Top to the right of the 140th New York, where Patrick O'Rourke, the colonel, is killed. This is some of the veterans of the 146 after they put up their monument on Little Round Top. So the other units in the brigade get Zouave uniforms over the winter of 1863, 1864. This is the 155th Pennsylvania Zouaves from Pittsburgh. And I'll just do a quick walk by. And see, each of these Zouave uniforms are different. Their Zouave uniform is the one here on the left. Dark blue with yellow trim. 146 New York is the one that's light blue with yellow trim. And then the 140th New York has dark blue jackets, dark blue pants with red trim. So each unit had a different looking Zouave uniform. And can you imagine this at the Battle of the Wilderness, Saunders Field? You have 1,500, 1,600 men in 3 different Zouave uniforms charging across Saunders Field. Must have been quite a sight. Another thing about this illustration is, look in the background. Where is that photo taken? Siege of Petersburg. So when you read books that Zouave uniforms disappeared, well, there they are, 1864, 1865 at Petersburg. Next one. And there's the 140th New York that was also in the brigade showing their Zouave attire. I put this one in here because I think this is an image of maybe the luckiest man alive on May 5th. His name is Edwin Newman. He was in the 5th New York, goes to the 146. He gets sick on May 4th, 1864. And I say he's probably the luckiest man in the Army. Although I'm sure there were more. But he gets to miss the battles. Although when he does come back to the regiment, he is wounded later in the war. So he's not a sure. Next one. This is Colonel David Jenkins. He is the colonel of the 146 New York. prior to serving in the Army, he helped recruit the 117th New York, couldn't secure a position with it. He is a lawyer from Vernon, New York, and he becomes colonel of the 146th New York after Kenneth Garrard is promoted. Next one. This is Henry Curran. He was a student at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, when the war began. Very dashing young man. He comes in as major and is lieutenant colonel at the time of the Battle of the Wilderness. So I'm kind of going to give you a photo survey of some of the men I have photos of that were at the Wilderness. Next slide. They are, at this time, G.K. Warren is now general. He had commanded the 2nd Corps for a time, but is given command of the 5th Corps. And underneath of Warren, I don't have an image, is Charles Griffin. They're in Griffin's division, and Roman Ayres on the right. They are part of Roman Ayres Brigade, which has now assumed the nickname the Zouave Brigade. Although they do have regulars attached, United States regulars attached to that brigade. But at the time of the Battle of the Wilderness, there are 3 regiments in Zouave attire. So David Jenkins is detailed as the general in charge of the outposts and pickets on May 4th, and on the morning of May 5th, he sees large bodies of Confederate troops coming down the Orange Plank Road towards his position. He sends a message to General Warren. General Warren communicates this to General Grant. This may have been a bit of surprise that the Confederates were advancing against them. Grant gets troops moving, gets Warren to start moving his corps forward, and they're coordinated with the division of the 6th Corps under General Wright on their right flank. That morning, General Warren, after getting this note, he goes to the 146th New York. He approaches Lieutenant Colonel Curran and tells him to send 2 companies to Jenkins on the picket line, and then shortly thereafter, the whole regiment moves out and gathers on this side of Saunders Field. But they are delayed 3 hours waiting for Wright to appear on the right flank to coordinate this assault. After 3 hours, Warren determines they better attack now, as the Confederates are just improving their defensive position. They gave him 3 hours to do that. But he felt any longer would just give them better position. Next map. Our next page is a map. This kind of is an overview of the fighting, which many of you are probably familiar with at the Battle of the Wilderness. Here's Ayres Brigade charging across Saunders Field here in this area. Next one. This is the regimental alignment for the brigade when they make the charge. The 140th New York, the U.S. regulars in the first line, 146th New York, 91st PA, 155th PA in the second line. Next one. And this one just kind of shows you the odds in numbers against Ayres and Bartlett's brigades here. And although they really aren't engaged at the same time, but you can see how many Confederate troops are in the vicinity. Of course, the Union troops don't know what they're heading into. So they sit at the edge of the woods here for a time. The men are in pretty good spirits. They're laughing, telling jokes, playing card games, telling stories, not knowing what is just ahead of them. There's an 1866 photo of Saunders Field, and one of the things is there's a gully halfway across this field. You can go out there, it's still there today. It's very recognizable. This will be mentioned in many accounts as a point to what stuff happens. But I thought it was pretty neat that there was a photo taken in 1866 of that area. The 140th New York starts out across the field. the 146 waits at the edge of the wood line. They are given the order to unsling knapsacks, and when the first line reaches the far wood line, they start out with fixed bayonets at the double quick. So they're following in the footsteps of the 140th New York, who is reaching the wood line, and you can see the 146 coming out of the woods behind them. As the 146 crosses their field, they get to the gully, and their former principal musician, George Williams, is now their color bearer. He is hit 3 times as they reach that gully. There's several heavy volleys that they receive. At that point, another man grabs the colors and carries it forward to the wood line, but this kind of breaks up the continuity of the regiment at this point in the charge. And then they reach the wood line. This is a painting done by Keith Rocco. You can see men of the 140th engaged, the Confederates right at the wood line, and the 146th New York approaching the woods. I think it's a pretty neat painting, but like I said, they dropped their knapsacks before they made the charge, so they should be wearing knapsacks or bedrolls. All right. So what happens is the Orange Turnpike is on this side here, and if you remember the map, the pike is on the left of the 140th and the 146th. Bartlett's brigade has not advanced. And what happens is all those Confederates you saw stack up in the area, they come out on the left flank of the 140th and 146th New York. So they rush a battery forward. It is Battery D of the 1st New York Artillery that comes up to about the gully. They unlimber and they start firing canister towards down the road and towards the wood line. Unfortunately for the men of the 140th and 146th, they're now taking canister in their back from their own artillery. Sure, it's taken out some Confederates, but one account said they took out as many New Yorkers as they did Confederates. So, but those guns are soon silenced, initially by Confederate sharpshooters, and then they make an advance, and the Confederates make an advance and capture the guns. Next slide. So they line, Kern is over on the left, Jenkins, the commander's to the middle right of the line as it goes into the woods, and when they get into the woods, Kern is immaculately dressed. He calls out to Captain King and says, "This is awful," and King responds, "Where are all the men?" And Kern says, "Dead." And then he plunges forward, hitting the head with a bullet. Next slide. King's on the right, Kern on the left. Jenkins goes into the wood line and is last observed holding a handkerchief to his head, wiping off perspiration and blood from his face. And he has been hit twice. He's been hit, he's leaning on a sword, he's been hit in the neck and in the leg. And I brought a little treasure with me that I really don't get an opportunity to share. And I acquired it some years ago with the financial assistance of some friends. But that handkerchief that he was wiping his head with and spotted with blood was recovered. And here it is, and it is monogrammed D.T. Jenkins, David Tuttle Jenkins. So I have a treasure of a relic from the Battle of the Wilderness, and unfortunate what happened to David Jenkins, but pretty neat that it still survives and was written about, and I was able to acquire it. So Jenkins and Curran were never saw again. Their bodies were never found. They made post-war searches, and you can go to the next slide. His brother, James Jenkins, did survive the battle, and he came down and searched for his brother, but they never found Curran or David Jenkins. Go back to one slide, please. Curran, they did put up a memorial marker to him in Forest Hill Cemetery in Utica, New York. And then a little interesting sidebar of that story is there were men of the regiment detail at Elmira Prison in New York, and when they brought in a new group of Confederate prisoners later in the war, two soldiers from the 44th Virginia, Captain Kloskins recognizes items that belonged to Curran, and he secured them from those prisoners and sent them to Curran's mother. Now, in the Richmond papers, the Confederates found his body. What happened to Curran, we don't know, but he was wearing an immaculate uniform, gold trim on his sleeves. He had probably his corps badge on, and another big medal with the initials HHC, Henry Hastings Curran. But he was so finely dressed that the Richmond paper speculated that HHC was either for General Couch or General Casey, and they said they had killed a Union or a Yankee general, but they're talking about Henry Curran, not Couch or Casey. This is Lieutenant William Sweet, and he wrote, "We ceased firing." This is talking about once they get into the wood line. He says, "We ceased firing when not a rebel opposed us. I went to the rear 20 paces and looked over the open field. We were not only flanked, we were doubly flanked. Rebel troops covered the open field." So these troops had come down the turnpike and got into the field behind the 140th and 146th. Orders went out, and there were also possibly bugle calls that called for the withdrawal of the regiments, which was going to be very perilous with the Confederate troops already out in the field behind them. At this point, the second color bearer is killed, and the only member of the color guard is the fellow on the left here, Conrad Nuschler. He grabs the flag and starts running across the field, and when he gets to that gully, it's about the same time he gets hit, and he falls into the gully and is unable to get up. There's numerous Confederates advancing on him to secure the flag, and that's when this fellow here, James Albert Jennison, dashes in between them and picks up the flag and starts running towards the far wood line in safety. And when he was a little guy, and of course he would have been in Zouave attire at this time. That's an early war photograph of him. They said when he ran zigzag and avoided the bullets that were being fired at him, and he refused to surrender. They were calling for him to surrender, and he becomes the hero of the regiment on that day. Veterans said about him, he was a man that was absolutely fearless. So when you have veterans say that about you, I think that's a pretty good compliment. Interestingly enough, the chaplain of the regiment, Edward Payson, crossed the field and was obliged to join in the fighting, and perhaps with some divine intervention, he miraculously made it back to the far side of the woods without a scratch. But it surprised the men to see the chaplain up there fighting with them in the midst of the battle. The whole engagement for the 146 New York was probably less than 10 minutes. So it's a pretty rough day. Next slide. Major Grimley takes command of the regiment, and he counts about 312 men killed, wounded, or missing. He himself survives the battle, but meets an unusual fate in 1907 when he's struck by a car, an automobile, and killed. An unusual fate for a Civil War veteran. Some accounts, I'm not expert enough on the Bell Wounds, there's accounts saying that at some point parts of the woods in the field catch on fire. adding to the horror of the day, burning the wounded alive. Very, very tragic scene. Next slide. Maybe I'll just point at you. This is Peter Foley. So out of all those 312 men killed, wounded, and captured, 3 officers were killed. Jenkins, Curran, and this fellow here, Peter Foley. And he is the only one we know where his remains are today. Foley was a veteran of the 5th New York, and it's noted in the regimental history that he captained one of the regiment's baseball teams. So they had multiple baseball teams in that regiment. He captained one of them. Interestingly enough, he had a premonition of his own death. Shortly before the battle, he had a haircut given by the regimental barber, and he said he wanted his hair cut short so the surgeon would get a good look at his wound. He was buried on the battlefield, killed in action, and today he rests in the National Cemetery at Fredericksburg. I put together kind of a list of some of the photos we have of men that were killed, wounded, or captured here. I think it's a nice way to remember them. Go on to the first slide. The man on the left here is Henry Jones. He's wounded in the right leg, but he does survive. He dies in Portland, Oregon in 1918. Another wounded officer is this fellow here, Charles Buckingham. Even though he's wounded, he does survive, only to be killed at Petersburg when he had crossed the lines to trade with Confederate soldiers, some newspapers, tobacco, coffee, and when he was on the way back to his own lines, he was shot and killed. Next one. Henry Loomis is the officer here on the left, who was wounded. This is Charles King, Captain Charles King. He was the fellow with Curran when Curran was shot in the head. These are the Wright brothers. Probably not the Wright brothers you're familiar with. They didn't have an airplane, or they might have escaped because both of them were wounded and captured. William Wright was shot in the left elbow. And Benjamin was wounded as well, but probably not as severe. He had fallen into that gully and was unable to get up, and as his brother Benjamin went to his aid, the Confederates captured both of them. This is Charles Walker. Got 2 images of Walker there, one earlier in the war, one later in the war. He was wounded through both arms, up closer to the shoulder, but ended up surviving. This is John McGeehan, who was captured, a lieutenant, and this is Isaac Powell, captain, who was captured in the fight. Next one. As well as William Sweet, who we read an account from, and Lawrence Fitzpatrick were also captured. Don't have many photos of men that were killed outside of the officers other than this fellow here. Robert Graves, he was killed in action on the field. I actually own that photograph, and there was no identification on it, and there's a place called the Horse Soldier up in Gettysburg that actually had another version of this same, another copy of this image, and that one was identified, so I was able to put a name with Robert Graves, and that's when I found out he was killed at the Wilderness. This is Jacob Fulmer. We had a lot of men that got wounded in the arm. He was shot in the arm as well. That's the first issue uniform, the New York State style jacket. How about that hair?
Yeah.
Man,
It's like today.
he must have gone to the store and got some good hair gel or something. Had to put Fulmer in there. Enlisted men that are wounded is Edward Payne here, and Milo Kellogg, who had formerly served in the 17th New York, which was like the 5th combined into the 146th New York. And he lived until 1918 and died in Ortaug, Washington. A good number of soldiers moving to the West Coast later in life. Next one. I was fortunate enough to acquire the scrapbook of Alfred Palmer. He was a drummer. He did survive the battle, but his brother George was captured. Nicely tinted image there, and their brother-in-law. He had married Alfred and George's sister. This is Edmund Glover. He was likewise captured at the Wilderness. And typically these soldiers that are captured end up getting sent to Andersonville initially. And then after Andersonville is emptied out, they get sent to Florence, South Carolina, and Salisbury, North Carolina. Some go to other prison camps, but those are the main ones. Next one. This is John Hess, another soldier that was captured. I had this image of him, a painting that hung on somebody's wall at some point. A friend of mine last year acquired this tintype, so I think they made the painting that I have off this tintype that my friend acquired, but he was captured in the Wilderness as well. Next one. William Newlove, another one of the men that were captured at the Wilderness. And then this one here is George Mole, which you can see him in his initial uniform of the 146, and then in his Zouave attire. And then this is Carroll Scott Waldron. And Waldron had been detailed as the brigade carpenter. But he asked to be turned to the regiment when the spring came because he said he preferred to take his chances with the boys. And he didn't want to be looked at as a shirker staying out of battle. So good for his character, but he might have regretted it because he did spend time in Andersonville and Florence prison camps, but he survives the war and dies in Los Angeles in 1921 when he's 85 years old. Next image. Now, I used to always say this years ago, as this is part of my Zouave program, is I always said, I found Osama bin Laden or anybody else. But it's not bin Laden. His name was Chauncey Smith, and the fellow here is Jesse Johnson. Great image. Look at that, he's got a Sharps rifle too. But he was captured, and they were both captured in the battle. They went down. They were both sent to Andersonville, and then after they went to Andersonville, they were sent to Wilmington, North Carolina, and from Wilmington they were being sent to Salisbury. And a guard randomly fired into the crowded car, and a bullet struck Smith in the chest and killed him. So very unfortunate ending for Chauncey Smith. Johnson dies of disease while he's at Salisbury. This is James Alverson. He was an original member of the 5th New York. You can see him in his 5th New York attire. And a sash with a triangle on it. Charles Brandegee is another 5th New Yorker that is captured, former 5th New Yorker. And Brandegee was 17 years old when he enlisted, and his descendants published a book, you may have seen it, I have it over here, called Charlie's Civil War, his letters to his family. A third former 5th New Yorker that is wounded and captured in this case is this fellow here, Silas Cargon. He is hit in the right arm. And you can see him here, this is his first wife, but you can see the empty sleeve there from where his arm is amputated. His arm was amputated by a Confederate surgeon. It turns gangrenous, and they have to re-amputate it, so he goes through 2 amputations on the same arm, just higher up. He gets paroled in September of 1864. This is Norton Shepard. He was wounded multiple times, and he wrote a memoir called Out of the Wilderness. I've got 2 copies of it left. I was surprised that I had those. Did bring them along, which is interesting because this memoir was selected by National Geographic to be part of their series Day Under Fire, where they focused on the Battle of the Wilderness and picked out several soldiers and followed them through the Battle of the Wilderness. And one of them is Norton Shepard. I throw this out here is because we know this is Norton Shepard, But in his account, he says he had replaced his fez with a soft felt hat. And I've always wondered if maybe this is Shepherd with his soft felt hat that he was wearing at the Battle of the Wilderness. So what do you think? Let's throw it out there. Most people say it's not. Most people say it's not. But I thought it was quite kind of interesting that he wrote about having that type of hat, and there was a photograph of a soldier in the 146 with that style hat. So Willard Shepherd says, in brief, he says, as we ran shouting across the field, many of our brave fellows fell. It seemed almost impossible to escape the storm of lead and hail. Upon entering the woods, his company was ordered to lay down and return fire. So I thought that was pretty interesting. He said he got off 2 or 3 shots when he heard the captain command, fall back. Upon getting up and getting ready to deliver a parting shot, he was hit in the right shoulder and then the right elbow. He said, my arm hung loose and useless at my side. Turning to run, a third bullet struck him in the side and kind of circumnavigated his body and lodged by the opposite hip. And at this point, he fell to the ground, said he felt like he had been hit with a club, knocking him forward onto his face. Laying there, he believed he was going to die, and he wondered if he had more credits than debits in the great book, because he wasn't sure. Eventually, Confederates found him, put him in an ambulance, and he was taken to the Robertson Tavern, where he was treated by a Confederate surgeon. He survived there 6 weeks when he was recaptured or liberated by federal troops. I think they couldn't get away, and there were no more Confederates there, and they were discovered. Next one. I put this in here because of the illustration of Locust Grove or Robertson's Tavern. I don't know if you've seen it, but since this is where many of the Union casualties were taken, including George Williams, the next one I'm going to talk about, and Norton Shepherd. Next one. George Williams. He's the color bearer I was telling you about that got hit carrying the flag right in that gully. He is captured and taken into the Confederate lines. He was born on the Rock of Gibraltar. His father was in the British Army. It was said to be the Scotch Greys, kind of famous from Waterloo, but I haven't really been able to prove that. When he was taken into the Confederate lines, he was looked over by a Confederate surgeon, and he heard the surgeon say in a low voice, no use doing anything for him, his blade is split. He cannot live long. Williams piped up and said, you are mistaken, doctor. I will live to fight you fellows again. The surgeon retorted, I shouldn't be surprised if you did. Men who talk like you are not easily killed. Williams lived to become a rather famous newspaper reporter, and in 1884 he wrote a book called Bullet and Shell, and died in 1920. The 146th New York, on May 6th, they were done fighting in the Battle of the Wilderness. On May 6th, they were put on the picket line, but they do see action again a few days later at Laurel Hill. The regiment continues to fight in the Army of the Potomac in the 5th Corps throughout the end of the war, right on to Appomattox. The Zouave Brigade distinguishes itself at engagements in Petersburg, and especially the Battle of Five Forks, where the 146th New York captured 3 Confederate regimental colors, and along with the brigade, more than 1,000 prisoners. So they are successful later in the war. So in June of 1864, the brigade is being depleted. They bring in another Zouave regiment. This is the 5th New York Veteran Volunteers. They are the regiment that has been recruited to replace the original 5th New York after they went home and mustered out. When they came back into service, they sent them up to Washington They were doing guard duty on the Alexandria Railroad, but when Grant is losing so many men after Wilderness and Spotsylvania, they send the 5th New York to the Army of the Potomac, and they are put into the Zouave Brigade, so very appropriate. Initially, they are wearing a uniform a little different from the original 5th New York. They've got what's called a mixed blue jacket, and their pants are probably more like this. But in August of November of 1864, they get the uniform like the original 5th New York. They weren't happy not having the same uniform as the original 5th. Interestingly enough, out of these officers, the only one to survive a war with the regiment is this one here. This is just showing you the difference in the 5th New York veteran uniform with those trousers that were baggy but separate legs, the white blue jackets, and then next is showing them after they received the uniform similar to the 5th New York. The Zouave Brigade, you can go on to the next one, is present at Appomattox, and here they are marching through Petersburg on their return from Appomattox. Okay, you can go on. So that ends the U.S. Army experience with Zouaves, but the French Zouaves continue on. Anybody celebrate Cinco de Mayo? Yeah, we got a yes, no?
Yeah.
Of course, yes.
Right? Okay. This is the Battle of Puebla in Mexico. That is the cause for celebrating Cinco de Mayo. French Zouaves were engaged there, and you can see the Mexican riding up and shooting one of the Zouaves. Because Maximilian was supported by Napoleon III. They sent French troops to Mexico during our Civil War, and the Mexicans were trying to get them out. Next slide. Zouaves continued in the French Army in the Franco-Prussian War, and this one is Zouave that has been seriously wounded, riding his Zouave regiment on a wall with his own blood. So Zouaves continue in the French Army, just like some units in the British Army continue to wear red coats. And Zouaves were in the French Army in World War I. And they were the subject of some of the first colored photographs. Why not? Next one. And it's really the German machine gun that puts an end to the colorful uniforms. In one charge against German machine guns, the Zouave regiment suffered 800 casualties. And so that's what does away with the Zouave attire. Although in the French Army, they kept their fezzes, so they would wear a helmet out on the field, but if they had a parade, they'd put their fezzes on. Next one. So here in the United States, the Zouaves still exist to a degree in militia companies and National Guard units. These are veterans of the 5th New York and also the 165th New York, which were both nicknamed Guerrier Zouaves. Next one. And they would outfit men to march in parades and for special occasions. Next one. And here you see some veterans of the 146th New York who still like to sport their Zouave attire as they grew older. Next one. And here's a meeting of GAR camp for the 146th New York. So they continued on as a veteran organization. And some of us still wear the Zouave uniform of the 146th New York today. This is myself when we were filming the Day Under Fire for National Geographic, where I had gathered some people to portray the 146th New York. And next one. So here's the group we got together for the filming of that show. So they did, I think, 3 or 4 different episodes, but I think National Geographic had a new president or whatever and didn't want, like, putting the military story in there, so they did away with the series after only 4 were produced. But it was a neat experience that we could still tell the story of the 146th New York today. And we'll wrap up with this. Veterans of the 146th New York referred to the Battle of Wilderness as the never-to-be-forgotten 5th of May. And it was certainly remembered daily by Silas Carbon here, who you saw earlier. And his stump of his arm that was amputated never healed, despite living until 1922. So the Battle of the Wilderness was a daily reminder to Carbon and other soldiers of the 146th New York. Thanks for letting me talk to you today. I appreciate it.
I was maintaining the trails of the wilderness. I saw a number of people come through who were looking for places that their ancestors had fallen. And the Civil War Study Group, I don't know if you're going to get a chance, actually has a monument to the fallen at Zouave Church.
Oh, okay.
So when you get up there, you might want to take a look at it. It's all the people. One was a high school professor who followed his 146 all the way down.
Interesting.
And he wound up here, where he died. And of course, the body wasn't found. So.
Yeah. Yeah, tell me a little more about that afterwards, if you would. It's interesting. I think that most of you have probably been over to Saunders Field at some point. I wanted to go out there this morning. I had a little extra time. I couldn't get a parking space. And there was, I didn't see anybody, but the parking lot was full. So I assume they're out doing trails.
They walk the trail.
Trails, yeah. Yeah. So, but the 140th New York, I think it was their reenactment group actually put up a monument out there in the field where the gully is. So. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I just want to know, is there any significance to the shape of the braiding?
Very good question. The question is there significance to the braiding? And I'm going to enlighten you. The braiding is called a tombeau. All right. So the Zouave uniform, I never really got into too much. You wear a fez, like the North Africans. A fez is a headpiece. You have a short jacket. Some units had vests. So 146 New York was never issued vests. So just have my checkered shirt on, which a lot of photographs show them wearing checkered shirts. They've got this long sash. They got the baggy trousers, and like I said, true Zouave trousers have no separate legs, just that bag. And then you have jambières and leggings, the white leggings. And then most soldiers, they're like in the U.S. Army, you wore a sack coat or a fatigue coat. That's your fatigue uniform. But you have a dress uniform with a Hardy hat that you pin up on the side, put an ostrich feather in there. You have the long frock coat with trim on it. For a Zouave, the only thing different for a Zouave to be in their dress uniform was wrap the turban around their head. So, but usually you didn't really fight in battle with these, especially in the summer. You wouldn't march in these because all the dirt and dust would soon change the color of that turban. So back to the tombeau. Is there any significance with that long lead up? No, just decoration. But in the French army there was. So in the French army, inside the bottom of the tombeau, there was a color. And that color, because most French regiments wore red trousers, blue jackets with red trim, the color inside the tombeau signified which regiment you were in. First, second, or third Zouaves. Red, white, or blue would be in the bottom of the tombeau. So in the French army, it did have significance, but in American army, it was just copying what typically Zouave jackets look like. Yes, sir.
So if a unit is at rest between engagements and they are attacked suddenly, is there a special routine that they go through? Obviously, they don't have a buddy roll them up in the, like you did at the beginning. Was there part of the routine is that they had to bring their sash with them, or?
Yeah, so you got to see me put on the sash. That's always a fun thing to do to get people initiated with the Zouave attire. Probably in a camp situation, if you're going to be assaulted that quickly, somebody's not doing their job because you should have pickets out to stop anything like that happening. I would imagine most Zouaves and probably most soldiers didn't get out of their uniform when they slept in the field. They probably did take their sash off, but probably weren't attacked that quickly that they couldn't get rolled up. If it was attacked that quickly, I'm sure they would disregard their sash and grab their musket instead. So. Yes?
This seems to be the most photographed war. It was a novelty. What was the cost of a tintype?
Oh, okay. Well,
It seems like there's pictures, not just because of Zouaves,
yeah.
but all the units.
Yeah. Fortunately, at least in the north, and it happened in the south too. So you go through stages of images. Actually, so I collect images, so I have a little knowledge on it. So initially, you have the daguerreotype developed in France. But the daguerreotypes are kind of silver, and you got to twist it and hold it the right way so you can see the photo. It then becomes an ambrotype, which is done on glass. So the actual negative is on glass. So it's clear. So unless you put a backing on it, you can't see it. So you got to paint the back of the glass black, or put it in a case that has a black backing so you can see that image. So that's an ambrotype. So that is in style mid-1850s to early 1860s. By 1860, they still exist, so do some daguerreotypes, but they're really fading out. They're going with what's called a tintype or a daguerreotype. So now it is, the image is put right onto the tin itself. The negative goes on the tin, and that's also why you're seeing a negative, so you're seeing the reverse of what the actual photo is, right? Going right on the tin. But by the time of the Civil War, especially in the North, a tintype might run you $3. Okay, so it's, what's that?
Today comes,
I'm sorry?
today comes, or then?
Oh, then.
That was a lot of money.
$3. Yeah, especially for a soldier, because they're being paid $13, $15 a month. But you have had a new invention come out, which is putting out images on what's called, after the French, carte de visite, or a calling card on a picture. Basically, what I tell people is basically like a baseball card. It's on cardboard. It's put on the paper's glued to cardboard, carte de visites. And those, at the time of the Civil War, you could get 6 or 8 of those for $1. So it becomes very affordable to have not just one image made, but multiple images made, and you can send them to your mother, your father, your grandmother, your children, your cousin, and everything like that. So yeah, by the time of the Civil War, that price of having a photograph made yourself has really come down with the invention of the carte de visite.
Thank you very much for watching, and I would want to remind you that our website, civilwarstudygroup.org, is updated on a regular basis and has lots of information that you might find of use. Thank you very much.